profitability is not luck, it's a strategy. Combine SEO, digital PR, and content distribution to grow. Visit adz.com to learn more.
Wix Studio, one end-to-end web creation platform for your agency to deliver exceptional work with absolute efficiency.
This is you without Collaborator. Invisible, just another seagull. And this is you with Collaborator. Get noticed in the AI era.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. My name is Jason Forbes, co-founder and CEO of SEO 360. I guess a quick survey. Who's heard of, in the room, Profound as a company? Okay. How about Scrunch? A little less so. How about Peak AI? Go Peak. So I think the word very few of us are mentioning right now is around profitability. And I think for 2026, making AI search profitable is likely to become a dominant kind of term or kind of area that people are exploring a little bit more. So said another way, if I'm a brand, do I end up better or worse financially when I take LLMs seriously? And so we began on a mission earlier this year, really looking into how to make AI search profitable. And I want to share some of those early findings and where this may go next. So an interesting kind of part is when we begun exploring this space, the early evidence suggests that fixing your own brand website may not be enough. And so as we've begun exploring this, if you look at the right-hand side here, it makes sense to start there, right? Ultimately, the brand website is one of the few web properties that you control directly. And so the changes that Jerome described in terms of log files or in terms of schema from James, it's absolutely where you need to begin because it's the part of the ecosystem you can directly control. But the early evidence suggests on the right-hand side is that your web property accounts for only 5% of all citation sources. So if you're a brand, when you're being recommended versus your peers, your competitors, often those citation sources extend outside of your own web property. So if you think of the purchase funnel that James was describing a second ago, it's hard to see on the bottom there, but from left to right, in the blue, the owned property becomes much more important towards the end of the funnel, right? You're about to make a decision, therefore the LLM will draw on your own website for pricing information, etc. But in the purple there, essentially is earned, and earned relates to every other web property. And so every other web property, it could be YouTube, it could be Reddit, it could be Wikipedia, it could be Amazon. These third-party websites typically account for 80 to 90% of all citation sources. So absolutely begin with your own brand website, then you need to take those other citation sources as seriously as possible. And this actually matches with evidence that we've seen from campaigns we're running at SEO 360 with brands like Nescafe, Red Bull, Olaplex, etc., where we're seeing about 5 to 10% of all citation sources coming from the brand's own website. Everything else is third party. And so we're going to spend time today unpacking that a little bit further. So a very simplified purchase funnel on the left-hand side. And I guess that the question that we should all ask is, as a brand, should I really take LLMs seriously? And the data that we're now seeing is that more than 3 billion people are now using LLMs on a monthly basis. So that's the population of China, the US, and Europe combined, plus another billion for good measure. So from a breadth perspective, LLMs clearly becoming a critical disruptive force for many brands. So you could argue then, well, maybe breadth is strong, but from a depth perspective, how influential are LLMs in terms of driving sales conversion? Well, earlier this year, we ran proprietary surveys in the UK, the US, etc. What we see on the right-hand side is from a rank perspective, search and LLMs are the most important drivers of sales conversion. This is research data. I'll show you more in terms of actual conversion data. But the big takeaway is those two words of both breadth and depth. We have LLMs as a disruptive factor, which suggests this is no longer a point of interest. This, for many brands in 2026, becomes a must-have channel to understand how do you drive better levels of citation sourcing to therefore benefit from that breadth and from that depth. So it was good. James just kind of touched on this a second ago. So one of the first questions, therefore, is, well, how do I tap into real consumer queries? And the simple answer is you cannot, right? You certainly can't do it at scale. Now, there's a few different approaches that are being used in the marketplace right now. One of the more obvious ones is with providers like SEMrush or Google Search Console. You can actually look at reasonable repositories of search keywords, right? And the depth of those keywords is a really good barometer for what are the queries that consumers might be using. But it's imprecise. And so query fanouts, et cetera, are other ways to try and replicate queries. But that comes with shortcomings. And so it's useful for scale, but it doesn't exactly replicate what the exact queries are. Another approach that, again, James kind of touched on is around using opt-in panels, so looking at log files. But what we found is even if it's an opt-in panel of 2 or 3 million people, branded mentions are typically only around 5% of queries. So if you're a brand, even if you're a brand like Nike or L'Oreal, what you'll find is even with a panel of 5 million people, once you get down to your category and your brand, that panel is much, much, much too small. Why do you care? Because it means on a weekly basis, if one person from that panel, if there's only 10 people talking about Nike on a weekly basis, if one person drops in or drops out day to day or week to week, your number is changing by 10%. If 3 people drop in or out, it's 30%. So if you're a brand trying to make decisions on panel data, you need a very, very large panel to make it work. And what we've heard from brands and from agencies is panels don't cut it. And so the takeaway is looking at different blended approaches, including repositories like SEMrush and panels you can complement and find a more accurate way to try and replicate some of those search queries. So another big topic is, well, how many questions should I ask as a brand? And I think this is a really interesting space because ultimately there's no right answer here. But again, back to data stability, is what we've found so far is when you only ask 50 queries, it's probably not going to cut it. Because with 50 queries, it becomes very hard to dive down. So if you imagine the stages of the funnel, if, for example, there's awareness, consideration, decision, and loyalty, that's 12.5 queries per funnel stage. What you find is as you start deep diving on each funnel stage, you need a larger data set. And so when we've run queries for brands, what we've typically found is 500 to 1,000 gives a much larger base, and therefore 1,000 responses, typically 12,000 to 15,000 citation sources. It's a larger data set to play with, and that allows you to mine much more intuitively across different funnel stages, across different audience segments, et cetera. So there's no right answer yet, but certainly as a brand, if you think about how many queries to run, think about data stability to inform what the right number could look like. Yes. So this is a fun one. One of the big challenges is, so I'm a brand and I want to understand who are the biggest competitors in my category, right? A big problem here is if you ask the LLM who are the biggest competitors of L'Oreal or Nike or Red Bull, you're already planting that you're Red Bull or L'Oreal, right? And so therefore you distort what the true representation is of your brand from a weighted distribution perspective. How big is L'Oreal? How big is Red Bull? And so again, there's no silver bullet here. One approach, again, is to use SEMrush, and again, look at a series of tools within SEMrush to understand the relative weighting from a keyword volume of one brand versus another. Another approach that we offer is to ask 50 open queries. So by asking the query, you need to define the category first of all. So for example, this is a brand called Olaplex. On the left-hand side is defining the category as hair care. On the right-hand side is defining it as hair repair. And you'll see K18, for example, on the left-hand side is number 2, and on the right-hand side is number 15. So defining the category is really important, because based on how you define the category will determine who the LLM sees as the major kind of competitors in that category. But by asking 50 to 100 open questions of the LLM, to say, which players would you recommend in hair repair? As I think about buying a hair repair product, who are the top kind of like providers to go after? By asking it like a number of different ways, the LLM shows its hand. And that show of hand essentially gives you a weighted distribution of competitors in your category, and you can use that to inform the 1,000 queries. So that's one approach that we found is giving more robust results over time. Okay, so this is interesting, and another kind of like, I wouldn't say secret, but certainly that isn't kind of like well discussed enough yet. And what it speaks to is, well, ultimately, how are you replicating the questions that consumers ask in the wild? Okay, most consumers, me, others, aren't using the API, right? And on the left-hand side, therefore, the best way to represent a consumer query is to use the ChatGPT UI, to use the Gemini UI, etc. That's the best and most accurate representation of how consumers really behave. The challenge with using the UI is to do that at scale can be both fragile and time-consuming. So if you want to ask 1,000 questions, okay, often, therefore, it's difficult to do that via a UI. And so a lot of players in the space are using the API. But the API brings a number of disadvantages, and you can see a couple of those on the right-hand side. So this is for the same kind of like query search for the same brand. What you see at the bottom here is that the citation count on the left-hand side is 8,000. On the right-hand side, using the API, is 2,000. So it means you're getting much fewer signals from the API. So that's one big problem, like 25% less citation signals. And those signals are key because they inform you as a brand where do you want to focus on to raise your visibility and therefore be recommended more often by one LLM versus another. The other really important point is if you actually look at the top 20 domains, they're very different. So for example, on the right-hand side with the API, I'm not seeing Reddit, I'm not seeing Amazon, etc. So OpenAI and others have almost certainly struck licensing deals with Reddit and others that actually preclude the API, right? And so again, if you're running analysis as a brand or for as an agency, take care of the API. It's not to say that it doesn't have value. It absolutely does at scale. It gives a directional indication, etc. But if you actually want what consumers are really seeing, it's the UI that counts. Richer citation volume, and actually it's showing the sources that it's tapping on to make its recommendations. So take care of that. So one of the challenges with 1,000 queries or more is you're getting a lot of signals back. And it's actually quite challenging at times, right, to really understand the signals or the insights from the noise. And so we haven't cracked the code here at all, but certainly kind of a couple of takeaways is we found that open search isn't enough. Okay, so if you're giving essentially all the responses from those 1,000 queries to a brand or to an agency, you need ways to mine that data. And one of the more valuable ones we found is using topic modeling. So what topic modeling does is it looks across those 1,000 responses and actually bubbles up the most important topics for the brand. And that allows the brand, therefore, to say, okay, if I care about flavor profile, because I'm Nescafe, I can double-click there and find out what consumers are really saying about my brand regarding flavor profile. Another really important one is sentiment, okay? If anyone in the room or any brand, they typically care more about what the negative things that people are saying. LLMs don't typically say negative things. They just won't mention you in the first place. And so finding ways to elicit negative responses and letting the brand understand what those negative sources are becomes really, really important. Reddit is often one of the biggest culprits. That's a really important source of negative topics that an LLM will draw on. And so if you're Nescafe, for example, you're looking to understand where is this negativity coming from. It's from Reddit. In Nescafe's case, it's because they've changed the flavor. It's become weaker, according to Reddit sources. So again, different ways to look at the data to identify the root cause of some of those issues and therefore find ways to unpack it over time. So left-hand side is a series of different citation sources. And on the right-hand side, I think one of the carryovers from SEO is this belief that higher frequency is better. Okay? I need to see my data near real time. I have to know, like, have I changed? Has my sentiment changed in the last 6 hours, in the last 2 days? And for some brands, that could be important. But you got to ask the question, so what? So literally your sentiment has changed, or literally your citation volume, your share of voice has gone from 17% to 16%. What are you going to do about it? And so I think this is a question we need to ask ourselves is, what's the right frequency? And again, there's no perfect answer, but I think one intuitive way to think about this is, what are you going to do with the data? Okay? And so we've begun kind of breaking out the actions that a brand can take into strategic actions and tactical actions. Okay? Tactical actions are things that you can ideally automate. So if I find that I've dropped from 16 to 13%, what can I do quickly? I can control my brand website. Maybe I need to change some of the content for those consideration phase queries that James was describing, because actually that's happening every day. So on the next day, I need to fix this content in my schema so that I can actually address the issue there. But for things that you can't control, okay, and many of these things you cannot. So for example, changing a set of comments on Reddit, changing how you're presented in Wikipedia is going to take months, okay? And so we'd argue, therefore, that frequency on some of this, dependent on the source, could actually be more like weeks or in some cases months. And so the takeaway is think about the citation sources and think about, as a brand or an agency, how quickly can you act on those citation sources. If the answer is very quickly, then tactical automation makes sense. If some of those sources and the actions around them will take longer, think more from a kind of a daily, weekly perspective in terms of frequency, because it's going to inform, it's going to make the data more manageable, so you're not overwhelming brands with a ton of data that they can't actually action in the first place. So this is kind of describes ultimately, once you've kind of understood what those sources are, what are you going to do about it? And James described this, for example, write content on your website in a schema-friendly way. And that's exactly right. And so what we've begun to do is to prioritize the different sources. There's no right answer to this. One obvious way to do this is based on, obviously, in this case, Tesco is getting the most mention volume, so focus on the sources that are driving the highest number of citations. Another one is obviously, well, where's the brand ranked? So in this case here, you'll kind of see that this brand is third on Sainsbury's. So for example, maybe I focus on the sources where I'm not number one right now. That might inform things. But I think for us is the level of impact is probably more just digestible for a brand at the program level. So what are the things I can actually do on Tesco? What are the things I can actually do on Reddit? And what's the level of effort to implement them? And the level of effort becomes interesting, right? Because obviously the more you can automate things, the easier the effort becomes. And so again, no silver bullet, but thinking through level of impact and level of effort becomes really important for brands to select what are the limited number of actions you can actually execute on given finite bandwidth, finite resource, finite budget, etc. So this is an example from another brand we're working with in the US. This is their Amazon PDPs. For FMCG brands, so CPG, consumer product goods, what you'll find is there's a ton you can do, and often citation sources like Amazon, like Walmart, like Target, like Boots feature very highly. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. These are three specific examples where just by improving the title, the bullet points, like the copy around about this item, or for example, the imagery would dramatically improve how this is being kind of like captured by an LLM and presented back as a citation source. So lots of opportunity there. What we've begun exploring now as XTO 360 is really taking that automation further. And so where we're going to be spending early next year is really demonstrating how you can bring a workflow automation to life. So ultimately, if you're recommending to a brand to fix its PDP, how can you create a kind of a content recommender, like a studio, that creates that PDP update? So update my title, my bullets, my imagery, etc., and then push that via, say, an Amazon Seller API, so you can actually push that content directly through to the product page. So the goal ultimately is by bringing automation, you're making the actions that much easier for the brand. But then there's one last kind of question, which is around attribution. And James touched on this as well. And as we think about kind of KPIs, there's a lot of debate right now around what the most important KPIs are. One less controversial one is percentage share of voice per source. So as a brand, if I'm Nike or if I'm Nescafe, what's my percentage of share of voice? Say 10% on Reddit. That means of all the times that we're running those 1,000 queries, how many times is my brand referenced on Reddit versus all the other competitors I'm up against? And am I changing that share of voice over time? Because what's critical is you can make all these changes to your schema, to your log files, etc. But if your competitors are doing this faster than you are, better than you are, then your share of voice is likely to go down by source. So it's not just about what you're doing, it's what your peer group are doing as well. So percentage share of voice or brand share of voice is one effective KPI to think about to show your relative movement over time. And the last one at the bottom there is really around sales lift. That's the biggest lag indicator. For all the changes that you've made as a brand, What can you attribute in terms of sales lift because you fixed your PDPs, you fixed your your content on your website? That's the ultimate lag indicator. And so for us, the goal ultimately is action, automation, attribution. If you can solve those 3 A's, you've really begun to unpack a series of major problems for brands and agencies in terms of turning LLMs from a threat into a major upside and a way to drive profitability at scale. So that's it. I guess we've bubbled all these into 10 best practices. We're learning as we go. We definitely don't have all the answers, but we think that these are 10 things to definitely think about if you are a brand or an agency and your goal is to drive AI search profitability. We're at stall 44. My name is Jason Forbes, so thank you for the time, and hopefully looking forward to continue the conversation.
Wait, do you want free ice cream, or do you want to know the latest in how search behavior is changing? If it's the latter, download Search Pulse by Reflect Digital. Get that now.
You've got 2 blind spots, keyword rankings and LLM visibility. Now, most tools solve one, but AccuRanker solves both. See how at booth number 18.
Monthly reporting making you want to shove sharp things up your nose? Try Dragon Metrics, the all-in-one SEO software with mind-blowing reporting tools.
Demand Sphere. Limitless visual insights from the SERPs. Unlimited dashboards and users. Easy to use and easy to scale your growth to new levels.